Long before the sugar mills and the rumble of Soviet missiles, the island of Cuba was a pristine archipelago. It was the realm of the Taíno, a peaceful, sophisticated indigenous people who farmed the fertile earth and fished the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. They called their home Colba. On October 28, 1492, Christopher Columbus stepped onto these shores. Overwhelmed by the island's immense beauty, he wrote that it was the most beautiful land human eyes had ever seen. But his arrival marked the beginning of the end for the Taíno way of life. 19 years later, the Spanish returned. Led by Diego Velázquez, the conquistadors swept across the island. Driven by a relentless thirst for gold, they brought with them steel, gunpowder, war dogs, and diseases against which the Taíno had no defense. Resistance was led by Chief Hatue, Cuba's first freedom fighter. When captured and condemned to burn at the stake, a priest asked him to convert to Christianity to enter heaven. Hatue asked if the Spanish went to heaven. When told they did, he replied, "Then I would rather go to hell." To extract the island's wealth, the Spanish implemented the encomienda system, legalized slavery. Within a few short decades, forced labor, brutal violence, and imported European plagues wiped out the vast majority of the island's native population. Witnessing this genocide, a Spanish priest named Bartolomé de las Casas experienced a moral awakening. Renouncing his own slaves, he spent the rest of his life documenting the horrors of the conquest and pleading with the Spanish king for native rights. As the gold ran dry, the Spanish adapted. Velázquez established the original 7 villas, including Santiago and Havana. Cuba transitioned from a mining outpost to a vast green pastureland, fueling a booming cattle and leather industry. But Cuba's growing wealth attracted new predators. In 1555, the French privateer Jacques de Sauret captured Havana, torturing its citizens for non-existent gold before burning the city to the ground. Spain realized they had to protect their Caribbean jewel. In response, Spain transformed Havana into a military stronghold. Massive fortifications, like the Castillo del Moro, were erected from coral and limestone, designed to repel the fierce pirates of the Caribbean. By the late 1500s, Havana was named the key to the New World. Every Spanish treasure ship carrying the gold of the Americas had to stop in Havana's harbor before crossing the Atlantic. It became a bustling cosmopolitan hub of gambling, taverns, and immense imperial power. In 1762, the geopolitical board shifted. A massive British armada captured Havana, holding it for 11 months. In that short window, the British introduced free trade and imported thousands of enslaved laborers, radically accelerating Cuba's transformation into a plantation economy. 30 years later, the Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves through the Caribbean. Fleeing the world's first successful slave rebellion, French planters escaped to eastern Cuba, bringing with them advanced agricultural techniques. Overnight, Cuba became the world's new sugar capital. Driven by the insatiable global demand for, quote, white gold, the Cuban landscape was devoured by the ingenios, massive sugar mills. The island's ancient forests were clear-cut, replaced by an endless, suffocating ocean of green sugarcane. To feed the sugar monster, Spain expanded its participation in the transatlantic slave trade. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were forced through the horrors of the Middle Passage, enduring unspeakable cruelty before being unloaded onto the docks of Havana. Life on the plantation was a waking nightmare. Enslaved workers endured grueling 18-hour shifts in the boiling houses and cane fields. At night, they were locked inside barracones, prison-like dormitories designed to prevent escape and extinguish hope. But hope could not be extinguished. Resistance was constant. Runaway slaves, known as Maroons, escaped into the treacherous mountains, building secret, fortified communities called palenques, where they lived as free men and women. In secret, African culture survived and evolved. By masking their Yoruba deities behind Catholic saints, enslaved Cubans preserved their ancestral beliefs, giving birth to Santeria, a spiritual heartbeat that still pulses through the island today. In 1812, a free black carpenter named José Antonio Aponte organized an island-wide rebellion to abolish slavery. His movement was discovered, and the Spanish authorities brutally crushed the uprising, displaying Aponte's severed head in a cage in Havana as a warning. The terror peaked in 1844, known as the Year of the Lash. Fearing a massive slave revolt, the Spanish paranoidly accused thousands of free Afro-Cubans, artists, and white abolitionists in the Escalera conspiracy, torturing and executing them tied to wooden ladders. Watching this brutal system from just 90 miles away were the slave states of the American South. Southern U.S. politicians, desperate to expand their slave empire, attempted to purchase Cuba from Spain, setting the stage for a century of American obsession with the island. The breaking point arrived in 1868. Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, a wealthy sugar mill owner, rang his plantation bell, freed his slaves, and declared war on Spain. Known as the Grito de Yara, this cry for liberty sparked the brutal 10 Years' War. A ragtag army was born. Known as the Mambises, these Cuban rebels were outgunned but fought with a terrifying new weapon, the sugarcane machete. In the dense jungles, the flash of Mambi's steel became the nightmare of the Spanish Empire. From the chaos rose a military genius, Antonio Maceo. Known as the Bronze Titan, this Afro-Cuban general survived 26 bullet wounds and led the rebel forces to legendary victories, striking fear into the hearts of the Spanish commanders. When white rebel leaders signed a peace pact in 1878 that did not abolish slavery, Maceo refused to accept it. In the famous Protest of Baraguá, he declared that there would be no peace without total freedom for all Cubans. The war ended in a bitter stalemate. It wasn't until 1886 that Spain finally, formally abolished slavery in Cuba. But for the newly freed population, true freedom remained an illusion. With no land or resources, most were forced to return to the same sugar fields as impoverished wage laborers. The dream of independence was kept alive by José Martí, a poet and philosopher living in exile. Traveling through the cigar factories of Florida and New York, Martí used his brilliant oratory to unite the fractured Cuban exile community and fund a final war for liberation. In 1895, the ultimate war of independence began. Martí returned to Cuba to fight, but was killed in his first battle at Dos Rios. His death transformed him into the eternal apostle of Cuban freedom, his martyrdom fueling the rebel charge. Desperate to crush the rebellion, Spanish General Valeriano Weyler implemented the Reconcentrado policy, the world's first modern concentration camps. Forcing rural Cubans into garrison towns, Weyler deliberately starved over 150,000 civilians to death. This humanitarian catastrophe was sensationalized by American newspaper magnates like William Randolph Hearst. Practicing yellow journalism, they stoked American public outrage, demanding the U.S. intervene to save Cuba from Spanish tyranny. On February 15, 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 260 American sailors. "Remember the Maine" became a battle cry. The United States declared war on Spain, fundamentally altering the course of Cuban history. The Spanish-American War lasted just months. U.S. forces, aided by the Cuban rebels, crushed the Spanish. But victory was stolen from the Cubans. At the Treaty of Paris, Cuban generals were banned from attending. The island was traded from one master to another. The new century began under U.S. military occupation. American administrators paved roads and eradicated yellow fever, but they also disbanded the Cuban rebel army, ensuring that political power remained strictly in American hands. Cuba was granted independence in 1902, but with a poisoned pill, the Platt Amendment. Inserted into the Cuban Constitution, this law gave the United States the legal right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it chose, and leased Guantanamo Bay forever. Tomás Estrada Palma became the first president of the Republic. but this was a hollow sovereignty. For the next 3 decades, Cuban presidents were largely viewed as puppets, easily overthrown or corrupted by American business interests. Racial tensions boiled over in 1912. The Independent Party of Color, formed by Afro-Cuban veterans, protested their exclusion from the new republic. In response, the Cuban government massacred over 3,000 Afro-Cubans, crushing the movement. During World War I, the price of sugar skyrocketed. Cuba entered, quote, the dance of the millions, an era of absurd, opulent wealth for the Havana elite. Mansions were built overnight. But when the market crashed in 1920, the nation's economy shattered. From this economic ruin rose Gerardo Machado. Elected in 1925, he transformed into a brutal dictator known as the Tropical Mussolini. He brutally suppressed labor strikes and famously fed his political opponents to sharks. The primary resistance to Machado came from the University of Havana. Student leader Julio Antonio Mella founded the Cuban Communist Party, organizing a fierce underground network before he was assassinated in Mexico by Machado's hitmen. By 1933, the island had had enough. A massive general strike, combined with an army mutiny, forced Machado to flee the country. A new revolution was underway, led by students and idealistic professors. The new government, led by Ramon Grau San Martin, lasted only 100 days, but it was incredibly progressive. They enacted the 8-hour workday, gave women the right to vote, and repealed the hated Platt Amendment. But Washington feared this new radicalism. With U.S. backing, an ambitious army sergeant named Fulgencio Batista led a counter-coup. Overthrowing the government, Batista became the undisputed power broker of Cuba for the next quarter century. Legitimizing his power, Batista was elected president in 1940, overseeing the passage of one of the most progressive constitutions in Latin America. For a brief moment, Cuba seemed to be transitioning into a stable democracy. During World War II, Cuba aligned firmly with the Allies. Havana's ports overflowed with U.S. sailors, and the city's thriving nightlife caught the attention of the American Mafia, who began eyeing Cuba as the ultimate vice capital. The late 40s ushered in the Auténtico era, a period of chaotic democracy, extreme corruption, and gangsterismo. Heavily armed political gangs roamed the University of Havana, fighting for turf and government patronage. By the 1950s, the American mob had taken over. Mob bosses like Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano turned Havana into their personal playground. Mega hotels and casinos sprouted up, laundering millions of dollars while the Cuban countryside starved. Realizing he was about to lose the 1952 presidential election, Fulgencio Batista struck again. In a swift, bloodless military coup, he suspended the Constitution and seized absolute power. The democratic experiment was dead. On July 26, 1953, a young, enraged lawyer named Fidel Castro led a suicidal assault on Batista's Moncada barracks. The attack was a catastrophic failure. Dozens of rebels were captured and brutally tortured to death. At his trial, Castro turned the tables on the dictatorship. Acting as his own defense, he delivered a legendary 4-hour speech outlining his revolutionary manifesto. He ended with the famous words, "Condemn me, it does not matter. History will absolve me." Released in a general amnesty, Castro fled to Mexico. There, he met an asthmatic Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara. United by a shared anti-imperialist zeal, they began secretly training a guerrilla army to invade Cuba. In late 1956, 82 rebels crammed onto an old yacht named the Grandma. Plagued by storms and seasickness, they landed in a Cuban swamp and were immediately ambushed by Batista's air force. Only around 20 men survived. The survivors fled into the impenetrable Sierra Maestra Mountains. Growing their signature beards, Los Barbudos launched a brilliant guerrilla war. They set up rebel radio and won the loyalty of the impoverished peasants, slowly strangling the Batista army. Simultaneously, an urban underground led by Frank Pais wreaked havoc in the cities. Bombings, assassinations, and sabotage paralyzed the regime, which responded with savage torture, turning the public firmly against Batista. The death blow came in December 1958. Che Guevara used bulldozers to derail Batista's heavily armored troop train at the Battle of Santa Clara. Stripped of his military power and U.S. support, Batista's regime was doomed. On New Year's Eve, 1958, Fulgencio Batista packed millions of dollars in stolen cash onto a private plane and fled into the night. On January 1, 1959, the Cuban Revolution had triumphed. Fidel Castro rolled into Havana on a tank to the adoration of millions. For the Cuban people, it was a moment of absolute euphoric hope. A white dove landed on Castro's shoulder during his speech, which many took as a divine sign of peace. But the revolution required blood. At the La Cabaña fortress, Che Guevara oversaw rapid, televised trials of Batista's police and torturers. Hundreds were executed by firing squad, sending a clear message: the old regime was dead. Fulfilling his promises, Castro enacted the Agrarian Reform Law, seizing massive U.S.-owned sugar estates and cattle ranches to distribute the land to the peasants. Wall Street was furious. The honeymoon with the United States was over. As private businesses were nationalized, Cuba's upper and middle classes realized a communist state was being built. They began to flee in droves, establishing a powerful anti-Castro exile community just 90 miles away in Miami. Gripped by rumors that the state would confiscate their children, parents made a heartbreaking choice. In Operation Pedro Pan, 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban children were flown to the U.S., separated from their families to save them from communism. In response to the nationalizations, President Eisenhower slashed the Cuban sugar quota and imposed the embargo. Castro retaliated by nationalizing every single U.S.-owned business on the island. By 1961, diplomatic relations were completely severed. But the revolution also transformed society. In 1961, 100,000 urban teenagers were sent into the mountains for the Great Literacy Campaign. In 1 year, they virtually eradicated illiteracy across the island, a feat celebrated worldwide. In Washington, the CIA was plotting. They secretly recruited and trained 1,400 Cuban exiles in Guatemala. Known as Brigade 2506, their mission was to invade Cuba, spark an uprising, and overthrow Fidel Castro. On April 17, 1961, they landed at the Bay of Pigs. It was a disaster. Fearing Soviet escalation, President Kennedy canceled the promised U.S. air support. Trapped on the beach, the invaders were crushed by Castro's army in less than 72 hours. Flush with a victory that humiliated the CIA, Castro finally dropped the mask. He officially declared the Cuban Revolution to be socialist, aligning the island permanently with the Soviet Union and locking Cuba into the crosshairs of the Cold War. Obsessed with revenge, the Kennedy administration launched Operation Mongoose, a covert campaign of sabotage and bizarre assassination plots against Castro. Terrified of another U.S. invasion, Castro pleaded with the Soviets for protection. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had a gamble. In total secrecy, he shipped 40 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles to Cuba, placing the Soviet Union's most deadly weapons just 90 miles from the Florida coast. On October 14, 1962, the secret was exposed. A U.S. U-2 spy plane captured undeniable photographic evidence of the missile sites under construction. The most dangerous 13 days in human history had begun. Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine to block further Soviet shipments. As Soviet freighters steamed toward the U.S. blockade line, the entire world held its breath, waiting to see who would blink first. Behind closed doors, military advisors pushed Kennedy to launch an airstrike, while Soviet generals urged Khrushchev not to back down. One miscalculation would trigger global nuclear annihilation. In Havana, convinced an American invasion was hours away, a desperate Fidel Castro sent a secret letter to Khrushchev, urging him to launch a preemptive nuclear strike on the United States if U.S. boots hit Cuban soil. Tensions peaked on Black Saturday when a Soviet missile crew in Cuba shot down a U.S. U-2 plane, killing the pilot. With war appearing inevitable, Robert Kennedy met secretly with the Soviet ambassador in Washington. A deal was struck. Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missiles. In return, Kennedy publicly pledged never to invade Cuba and secretly agreed to remove obsolete U.S. nuclear missiles from Turkey. The apocalypse was averted. But one man was furious. Left entirely out of the negotiations, Castro felt humiliated and used as a pawn by the Soviets. His anger was absolute, but Cuba was now permanently tethered to the Soviet Union's survival. Disillusioned with Soviet bureaucracy, Che Guevara resigned his government posts. Dedicated to global revolution, he left Cuba in secret, attempting to spark many Vietnams in the Congo before setting his sights on South America. In 1967, Che was captured and executed by CIA-backed forces in the jungles of Bolivia. In death, the image of the martyred revolutionary became a global pop culture icon of rebellion for generations to come. Seeking economic independence, Castro mobilized the entire nation in 1970 for the 10 million ton sugar harvest. The effort failed. The country's infrastructure was wrecked, leaving Cuba entirely dependent on Soviet economic subsidies. Social control tightened. The regime created UMAP camps, forced labor facilities. Homosexuals, priests, and youths who listened to rock and roll were rounded up and sent to the fields to be rehabilitated into good socialist citizens. Despite its size, Cuba punched above its weight on the global stage. Castro sent 50,000 troops to Africa, fighting in Angola and Ethiopia, successfully helping to defeat the South African apartheid army and supporting anti-colonial movements. But by 1980, domestic frustration boiled over. When Castro removed guards from the Peruvian embassy, over 10,000 Cubans stormed the compound in just 48 hours, desperately demanding political asylum. A massive crisis was born. Cornered, Castro opened the port of Mariel, inviting Miami exiles to pick up their relatives. In the chaotic boat lift that followed, 125,000 Cubans fled the island. Castro took the opportunity to empty his prisons and mental asylums into the boats. Those leaving faced the fury of state-sponsored mobs in acts of repudiation. Chanting, "Let them go, we don't need them," loyalists attacked the homes of the immigrants, deepening the permanent psychological fracture of the Cuban family. In 1989, a shocking televised trial gripped the nation. Arnaldo Ochoa, Cuba's most decorated war hero, was executed for drug trafficking. Many believed it was a ruthless purge by Castro to silence a potential rival. Then the unthinkable happened. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Overnight, Cuba lost its only trading partner and 80% of its imports. The economic lifeline was severed, plunging the island into darkness. Castro declared the special period in time of peace. It was an era of agonizing austerity. Rolling blackouts lasted 16 hours. Factories closed. Without food, the average Cuban lost 20 pounds. Cats and dogs disappeared from the streets. To survive, Castro was forced to compromise the revolution. In 1993, he legalized the U.S. dollar, permitted foreign hotel investment, and allowed small private businesses. A new class system was born, those with access to dollars and those without. The desperation erupted in August 1994. The Maleconazo saw the first mass anti-government riots in decades. Fidel Castro himself went down to the Malecon to calm the crowds, diffusing the immediate threat. To relieve the pressure, Castro once again told the Coast Guard to stand down. 35,000 Cubans took to the shark-infested waters on homemade rafts made of styrofoam and inner tubes. Countless souls were swallowed by the Florida Straits. In 1996, Cuban MiG fighters shot down 2 unarmed planes belonging to Brothers to the Rescue, a Miami exile group searching for rafters. In retaliation, President Clinton signed the Helms-Burton Act, making the U.S. embargo permanent federal law. In 1998, Pope John Paul II made a historic visit to Cuba, calling for the world to open to Cuba and Cuba to open to the world. It was a moment of deep spiritual rejuvenation for a tired nation. The dawn of the millennium was dominated by the saga of Elian Gonzalez, a 5-year-old shipwreck survivor. The bitter custody battle between his Miami relatives and his father in Cuba consumed both nations, ending with federal agents seizing the boy to return him to Havana. Salvation arrived from the south. The election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela provided Cuba with a new ideological ally and a massive economic lifeline. In exchange for thousands of Cuban doctors, Venezuela shipped cheap oil to the island. With the economy stabilized, the regime cracked down. In the Black Spring of 2003, the government arrested 75 independent journalists, librarians, and dissidents, handing down prison sentences of up to 28 years. From this injustice rose the ladies in white, the wives and mothers of the political prisoners. Marching silently through Havana every Sunday dressed in white, they faced brutal harassment, becoming the courageous face of the Cuban opposition. In 2006, the impossible happened. A severe illness forced Fidel Castro to step down. Power was transferred to his brother, Raúl. For the first time in nearly half a century, the Supreme Comandante was no longer at the helm. Raúl initiated slow, pragmatic reforms. Cubans were finally allowed to buy and sell their homes, own cell phones, and travel freely. A booming private sector of entrepreneurs, known as cuentapropistas, began to reshape Cuban daily life. In 2013, secret back-channel negotiations began in Canada, brokered by Pope Francis. Enemies for over 50 years, the US and Cuba were quietly mapping a way out of the Cold War free. On December 17, 2014, the world was stunned. Presidents Barack Obama and Raúl Castro simultaneously announced the restoration of diplomatic relations. Embassies reopened, family flights resumed. It was el deshielo, the thaw. Obama made a historic visit in 2016, speaking directly to the Cuban people about a future of hope and democracy. Weeks later, the Rolling Stones played a free concert in Havana to over 500,000 screaming fans. Cuba felt electric. But the year ended in mourning. On November 25, 2016, Fidel Castro died at age 90. As Cuba entered 9 days of silence, the streets of Little Havana in Miami erupted in celebration. The ultimate symbol of the 20th century was gone. The thaw was short-lived. A bizarre diplomatic crisis involving unexplained sonic illnesses among U.S. diplomats, dubbed Havana Syndrome, led the Trump administration to roll back Obama's policies, tightening the economic screws once again. In 2018, Miguel Díaz-Canel became president. For the first time since the revolution, a Castro did not rule Cuba. But Díaz-Canel inherited a perfect storm: the collapse of Venezuelan aid, suffocating U.S. sanctions, and the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic. Pushed to the breaking point by food and medicine shortages, thousands of Cubans took to the streets on July 11, 2021, shouting, "Patria y vida," homeland and life. The regime responded with a brutal crackdown, arresting over 1,000 protesters. Today, facing a historic economic crisis, a record 500,000 Cubans have left the island in search of a better life. Yet for those who remain, the spirit of Cuba endures, bruised but unbreakable, a beautiful, tragic pearl waiting for the storm to finally pass. Thank you for joining us on this journey. The history of Cuba is a testament to the endurance, passion, and unbroken spirit of its people. We hope this documentary has offered you a deeper, more meaningful understanding of this complex and beautiful island. Thank you for watching.